fleeting glance through a train window reveals a shocking murder. But when nobody is found, only one person believes it happened. Welcome to Café Tales. I'd love to know where you're listening from today. Your comments mean the world to me, and I always enjoy reading them. Let's get started. Shall we? Miss Marple and the Murder on 450, Chapter 1. A Most Disturbing Journey, from Paddington. Chapter 1. A Most Disturbing Journey. It was 5 minutes to 5 when the 450 from Paddington pulled into the station at St. Mary Me. The December evening had closed in some time ago, and the refreshing patter of rain against the window panes which had accompanied the latter half of the journey now seemed to intensify as the train slowed to a halt among the few passengers. Who alighted was Mrs. Elspeth McGillicuddy, a tall, ample-figured woman with a determined jaw and clear, shrewd eyes, the kind of woman whom few would dare to contradict and nobody would dream of pitying. She collected her various parcels and bags, the fruits of a day's Christmas shopping in London, and descended with some difficulty to the platform, only to be met by a gust of wind that threatened to disarrange not only her carefully secured hat, but her usually unshakable composure. The porter touched his cap. "Nasty evening, madam, indeed," said Mrs. McGillicuddy fervently. "A week before Christmas, too. Most unfortunate. Is there a taxi?" "Not a night, Mom. But seeing as it's you, I could telephone for one to come, thank you." "But no. Miss Marple, I's expecting me. She said her gardener would meet me with a wheelbarrow for my part castles." True enough. A few moments later, the stooped figure of old Jim appeared, wrangling a somewhat rickety wheelbarrow. After a brief exchange and the loading of packages, Mrs. I. McGillicuddy found herself navigating the familiar path to Miss Marple's cottage, though with considerably less enthusiasm than she had anticipated when arranging this Christmas visit to her old friend. Something had disturbed her. Something had distressed her greatly. The cottage was just as she remembered, the gleam of firelight visible through the drawn curtains, and the soft glow of a lamp in the hall. As the door opened to admit her, Miss Marple stood in the doorway, a tall, thin figure with snow-white hair and a face that, despite its wrinkles and age, maintained a curious youthfulness, chiefly due to the alert, sparkling eyes which could observe and evaluate with remarkable accuracy. "Elspeth, my dear," she exclaimed, "how lovely to see you, but you're wet. Through, come in at once and get warm." Within 5 minutes, Mrs. McGillicuddy was installed in the most comfortable chair, before a crackling fire, a hot toddy in her hand and her wet coat, and had whisked away to the kitchen to dry. "You're trembling, Elspeth," said Miss Marple with concern. "You must be frozen. Was the train terribly draughty?" "No, Jane," said Mrs. McGillicuddy, "it's not the cold. It's something else. Something dreadful. I hardly know how to tell you." She took a deep gulp of her toddy and seemed to gather her resources. "I saw a murder, Jane, on the train." Miss Marple's knitting needles, which had been clicking peacefully, stopped abruptly. "You saw murder," she repeated carefully. "Yes." Mrs. McGillicuddy, I sat down her glass and clasped her hands tightly. "In her lap, coming down just now, not in my compartment in the wound that passed mine going the other way." Miss Marple looked at her friend keenly. Elspeth McGillicuddy had always been a sensible woman, not given to flights of fancy or hysteria. She was dependable, level-headed, and above all, truthful. "If Elspeth said she had seen a murder, tell me," said Miss Merrill. "We'd been standing at a signal, and then we started off again. Another train was coming in the opposite direction. My blinds weren't drawn, and I happened to look up, and the blinds in the carriage going past weren't drawn either. And I saw it quite distinctly. A man with his back to me, and he had his hands round a woman's throat. He was strangling her. I saw it, Jane. Her face was all distorted and congested. Horrible, dear," said Miss Marple. "What a very distressing experience. The most awful thing about it," continued Mrs. McGillicuddy, "is that in a moment they'd gone. The trains had passed, each other. I couldn't do anything at all." "What did you do?" "I got up and went along the corridor to find the conductor, or the guard, or whatever they call him. Yes, I told him what I'd seen. He didn't believe me. He was polite but quite incredulous. He asked me what I thought he could do about it. Told him to stop the train and fetch the police. He said he couldn't stop the train, not on my say-so, and that the other train would be miles away by now, and I couldn't even say for certain which train it was, whether it was going to London or coming. From London he asked me for details, which carriage I'd seen it in, what the woman and man looked like, and what did they look like. Asked Miss Marple. I couldn't see him properly, only his back. He was tallish dark, and wore a heavy overcoat. She was fair-haired, I think, but I couldn't really see distinctly her face. Her face was all contorted and purple. Oh, it was horrible, Jane. Mrs. McGillicuddy shivered. And there's more. When we got to Brampton, I spoke to the station master. He was civil and listened to what I had to say, but I could see quite plainly that he didn't believe a word of it. He probably thought I'd been dreaming or had had too much toe drink. Most distressing for you, said Miss Marple with sympathy. What happened next? Nothing happened, said Mrs. McGillicuddy grimly. Nothing at all. What could happen? They think I'm a stupid, hysterical, middle-aged woman. And perhaps in a way I don't blame them. It's an extraordinary story to tell. If I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I wouldn't believe it either. I believe it, said Miss Merrill quietly. Mrs. McGillicuddy cast a grateful glance at her. I knew you would, Jane. We've known each other for a long time, said Miss Marple. We were at school together. We are both, if I may use the term, bound to be taken seriously. We are known to be sober, serious-minded women, not given to flights of fancy. You saw what you saw, Elspeth, but what can I do about it? Asked Mrs. McGillicuddy desperately. If nobody will listen, someone has listened. Her friend reminded her. I have listened. Yes, but Mrs. McGillicuddy hesitated. That's not quite enough, is it? It's a beginning, said Miss Marple. Her eyes, sharp and bright, looked into the distance, and Mrs. McGillicuddy felt a familiar slight apprehension. Once many years ago she had taken canned tea with Jane Marple, and an elderly, fragile-looking old lady who had been introduced as Jane's great-aunt Fanny. Afterwards Jane had said, Great, Aunt Fanny sees a great deal more than most people would credit. I'm afraid I take after her a little, Mrs. McGillicuddy remembered the words now. If you're sure it wasn't a dream or some kind of optical illusion. Mrs. McGillicuddy snorted. I may be getting on in years, and my eyesight isn't what it was, but I'm not given to hallucinations. Jane. No, said Miss Marple. Neither of us is of the temperament to imagine things. That makes what you saw all the more interesting and suggestive. Miss Marple picked up her knitting once more. Can you remember any more details of what you saw? The woman's clothes, for instance. Mrs. McGillicuddy, I considered she was wearing a fur coat of some kind, I think. But it was open or pushed back. Back there was something blue, a dress or a suit. Underneath, you say? The train was just leaving a signal. Yes, we'd been held up for a few minutes. So the train going in the opposite direction would also have been held up by the signal. The blinds were not drawn in either carriage. No, so there must have been sufficient light to see clearly. You were quite sure in your own mind what you saw? Absolutely. Certain I saw a man strangling a woman, and I don't know what to do about it. There are several things we might do, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. The most important thing I should say is to discover the identity of the woman's body, but we don't know. Where it is not yet, said Miss Marple, but we will find out. She rose, walked to the window, and gazed out into the dark garden, her figure silhouetted against the glass. Yes, we shall have to be very careful and very clever. Someone, you see, has committed what they believe to be the perfect crime, but no crime is perfect. Elspeth, there are always loose ends. She turned back to her friend, her eyes bright with resolution. Tomorrow, she said, we shall begin our investigation. It will require patience, clear thinking, and a willingness to believe in the impossible, the impossible. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked puzzled. Not impossible to you or me, said Miss Marple, resuming her seat, but impossible certainly to the police and railway authorities. The murder of a woman on a train for which there is no evidence except the word of one reliable witness. A murder, moreover, where there appears to be nobody. She picked up her knitting again, her needle moving. Rapidly. Leave it to me, Elspeth, she said gently. We shall get to the truth, and then we always do. Chapter 2. The village remembers the following morning dawned clear and crisp, the previous night's rain having given way to a pale winter sun that cast long shadows across Miss Marple's frost-covered garden. She had risen early, as was her custom, and after attending to her morning correspondence, sat by the window with her knitting, deep in thought. Mrs. McGillicuddy appeared at 9:30, having enjoyed the restorative properties of a good night's sleep through the troubled expression. Had not entirely left her face. "I've been thinking, Jane," she said, as she accepted a cup of tea. "Perhaps I should go to Scotland Yard. They might take it more seriously than the local police." Miss Marple shook her head, gently. "I don't think that would serve our purpose, Elspeth," she replied. "Without a body or any evidence beyond what you saw, which was admittedly brief, I'm afraid, they would be no more inclined to believe you than the railway officials then. What are we to do?" asked Mrs. McGillicuddy. Frustration evident in her voice. "We must approach this methodically," said Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "First, we must establish whether there are any reports of missing women that might correspond to our victim. Second, we must consider where a body might have been disposed of from a train on that particular line." She paused, her eyes taking on that far away look that Mrs. McGillicuddy had come to associate with her friend's remarkable powers of recollection, you know. "Elspeth," she said slowly, "this reminds me rather forcibly of something that happened here in St. Mary Mead about 15 years ago. Do you recall my mentioning Tom Pickering?" Mrs. McGillicuddy frowned. "The name sounds familiar. Wasn't he the man who used to sweep the church path?" "The very same," nodded Miss Marple. "Poor Tom had a weakness for strong drink, I'm afraid, most regrettable. He lived in that little cottage by the stream. The one with the crooked chimney." She laid down her knitting and leaned forward slightly. "One summer evening, Tom came rushing into the village pub in a state of great agitation, claiming he had seen a man stabbed while he was walking along the railway embankment. Nobody believed him, of course. They all thought he was suffering from what Dr. Hawk calls delirium tremens, even Conant. Davis merely patted him on the shoulder and told him to go home and sleep it off. "And had he imagined it?" asked Mrs. McGillicuddy. "That's just it," said Miss Marple. 3 weeks later, the body of a man was found in Farmer Mitchell's compost heap, quite badly decomposed, but with clear evidence of having been stabbed. It turned out to be a commercial traveler who had gone missing on the very day Tom claimed to have witnessed the murder she picked up. Her knitting again. People were rather more careful about dismissing Tom's stories after that, though I'm afraid his fondness for gin didn't diminish. Mrs. McGillicuddy's eyes widened. "So you think the same thing might have happened here, that there really was a murder on that train?" "I am quite certain of it," said Miss Marple firmly. "The question is, where is the body now, and who was the unfortunate woman?" She rose and moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. "I think, Elspeth, that I should write to my godson, Detective Inspector Dermot Craddock. He's at Scotland Yard now, you know, and has been most successful. He sometimes asks for my advice on cases most gratifying. I think he might be persuaded to make some discreet inquiries, but will he believe me when the railway people didn't?" asked Mrs. McGillicuddy doubtfully. Miss Marple smiled. "He will believe me, my dear. We have worked together before, and he knows I am not given to flights of fancy." She began to pen her letter, while Mrs. McGillicuddy finished her tea. A knock at the door announced the arrival of Miss Marple's daily help, who entered bearing a basket of provisions. "Good morning, miss," she said cheerfully. "Terrible cold it is today. Oh, Mrs. McGillicuddy didn't know you was visiting. How nice." "Good morning," Florence said. "Miss Marple, any news in the village today?" "Well, as a matter of fact, there is," replied Florence, setting down her basket. "They say there's someone moved into Rutherford Hall at last, a lady, they say, related to old Mr. Kraken. Thorpe somehow, Emma, something or other indeed," said Miss Marple, her interest quickening. "Rutherford Hall has been empty for so long. It's that big old house beyond the railway cutting, isn't it?" "That's right, miss, falling to pieces it is. Don't know why anyone would want to live there. All those rattling trains, going past at all hours, give me the creeps it would miss." Marple's eyes met Mrs. McGillicuddy. "The railway line," she said softly. "The same line that your train was in yesterday, Elspeth. How very interesting." After Florence had departed to the kitchen, Miss Marple spread out a local map on the table. "Let me see," she murmured. "The 4:50 from Paddington passes Rutherford Hall at approximately 5. Your train would have been held at the signal just. Before that point, the two trains would have passed each other, somewhere along this stretch. Her thin finger traced the route, and Rutherford Hall stands just here with its grounds extending down to the railway embankment. You think that's where it happened? Asked Mrs. McGillicuddy. I that the body might be somewhere on the grounds of this Rutherford Hall. It seems a distinct possibility. Said Miss Marple, if the murderer was familiar with the area, he would know that there is a sharp curve in the track. There, causing trains to slow considerably, it would be an ideal place to dispose of evidence. She completed her letter to Detective Inspector to addressing and sealing the envelope with precision. Now, she said, I think we should learn a little more about Rutherford Hall and its occupants, both old and new. I believe I shall pay a visit to the vicarage this afternoon. The Reverend Julian Harmon's wife, Hilda, knows absolutely everybody, and she had an aunt who was acquainted with the Dermot Craddock family. And what shall I do? Asked Mrs. McGillicuddy. You, my dear. Said Miss Marple, should rest. You've had a shock, and perhaps tomorrow you might accompany me to the station. Who'd like to check the train schedules more precisely later that afternoon. As Miss Merrill made her way carefully along the frosty lane to the vicarage, she found her thoughts returning to Tom Pickering and his vindicated story. There was something else about that old case, something that nagged at her memory, something about the timing and the disposal of the body. The vicarage gate creaked as she pushed it open, and as she walked up the path, she noticed a car parked in the drive, an expensive model that seemed out of place in the modest surroundings of St. Mary. Me, a visitor to the vicarage? Perhaps Miss Marple quickened her pace slightly. If there was one thing more useful than Hilda Harmon's extensive knowledge of local affairs, it was the opportunity to observe and assess a stranger to the village. She adjusted her hat, settled her features into an expression of benign elderly interest, and prepared to gather the first threads of what she already sensed would be a tangled and dangerous web. Chapter 3. The House on the Hill. 3 days had passed since Miss Marple had dispatched her letter to Detective Inspector. Response had arrived that morning. A brief note assuring her that he would look into the matter, though he could not promise immediate attention due to his current caseload. Miss Marple had expected no less. The police, after all, required evidence more substantial than one elderly lady's conviction that her friend had witnessed murder. We shall have to make our own inquiries, Miss Marple told Mrs. McGillicuddy, as she carefully arranged flowers in AAS. I've made some discreet inquiries about Rutherford Hall, and I believe I found a way to secure an invitation. An invitation? Asked Mrs. McGillicuddy, looking up from the newspaper. She had been scanning for reports of missing women. How have you managed that? Through the Women's Institute, replied Miss Marple with a satisfied smile. Mrs. Blackett, you remember the doctor's wife mentioned that they're organizing a charity committee for the Winter Relief Fund. It seems the new resident at Rutherford Hall has agreed to join. I've volunteered as both for the committee, and there's to be a meeting there tomorrow afternoon. Mrs. McGillicuddy looked doubtful. But what will that achieve? It will get us inside the house, said Miss Marple. And once inside, one can observe all manner of things. It's so much more informative than hearsay. Don't you think the following afternoon found the two ladies walking up the long neglected drive to Rutherford Hall? It was an imposing Victorian edifice built in an era when prosperity and permanence had seemed assured. Now, however, it wore an air of Gentile decline. Paint peeled from the window frames, ivy encroached unchecked upon the brickwork, and the once formal guard had surrendered to wilderness. Not very welcoming, as it observed. Mrs. McGillicuddy, quite the contrary, said Miss Marple, her sharp eyes missing nothing. And yet someone has been attempting some improvements. Look at those rose bushes recently, pruned, though not by an expert hand. As they approached, the front door had opened to reveal a woman of perhaps 50, plain-featured but with intelligent eyes and a capable manner. You must be Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy, she said, extending her hand. I'm Emma Stoddard. Please come in. You're the first to arrive. The interior of Rutherford Hall was as neglected as its exterior, though marginally warmer. Miss Marple noted the good proportions of the entrance hall, the quality of the wood paneling now dulled by years of inadequate care, and the faded grandeur of the Persian carpet beneath their feet. This way, Please, said Miss Stoddard, leading them into a drawing room where a fire struggled somewhat ineffectually against the chill my cousin Luther prefers to keep to his rooms upstairs, but he's agreed to have the committee meet here. It's rather a large house for just the two of us. Have you been at Rutherford Hall long? Miss Stoddard inquired, Miss Marple accepting a seat near the fire. Only 3 weeks, replied Emma. I was nursing in London for many years, but when my aunt died and left me a small legacy, I wrote to Cousin Luther. His health is poor, you see, and he needs someone to manage the household. His children visit occasionally, but they all have their own lives. How many children does Mr. Crackenthorpe have? Asked Miss Marple. 4 living, said Emma. Harold is the eldest. He's embanking in the city. Then there's Alfred, who's always involved in some business scheme or other. Cedric lives abroad. In Ibiza, I believe he's an artist of sorts. And then there's Emma. She was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. That will be the others, she said, rising. Excuse me a moment. Left alone, Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy exchanged glances. Well whispered. Mrs. McGillicuddy, a most interesting situation, murmured Miss Marple. A large house, a reclusive owner, and a new housekeeper who happens to be a relation. And did you notice she said 4 living children? I wonder what happened to the others. The drawing room soon filled with the remaining committee members, Mrs. Blackett, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Harmon, and 3 other ladies from the village. Tea was served, and the business of the Winter Relief Fund discussed with appropriate thoroughness throughout it all. Miss Marple maintained her air of benign elderly interest, while missing nothing of her surroundings or the conversation. As the meeting concluded, Miss Stoddard offered to show the ladies around the ground floor of the house, an invitation that Miss Marple accepted with alacrity. It's a beautiful home. Despite needing some attention, she remarked as they toured the dining room with its massive mahogany table and tarnished silver candelabra. My cousin's father built it, explained Emma. He was in biscuits quite successfully, as you can see, but death duties took their toll, and Luther is careful with money. Careful, snorted Mrs. Blackett. That's one way of putting it. Everyone knows old Crackenthorpe is tighter than a drum, won't spend a penny unless he's forced to. Emma Stoddard's lips tightened, but she made no reply. The tour continued through a library with leather-bound volumes, gathering dust in a morning room that had clearly not seen a morning visitor in years. As they returned to the entrance hall, Miss Marple paused by a window that overlooked the back garden. What a lovely view of the railway, she observed innocently. The trains must pass quite close. A shadow seemed to cross Emma Stoddard's face. Yes, rather too close for comfort sometimes. The noise can be disturbing. I imagine one gets used to it, said Miss Marple. Was that line there when the house was built? No, it came later. Mr. Crackenthorpe Sr. fought it bitterly, but progress, as they say, cannot be stopped. The compensation was substantial. I believe, though, my cousin Luther would say it was inadequate. As the other ladies prepared to leave, Miss Marple lingered, her attention caught by a stone object visible through a side window. How interesting, she remarked, is that a sarcophagus in the garden. Emma Stoddard followed her gaze. Yes, another of the old gentleman's acquisitions. He had antiquarian interests. It's Roman, I believe, brought back from a tour of Italy, rather out of place, but too heavy to move easily. Indeed, said Miss Marple. And how fascinating. As they walked back down the drive, Mrs. McGillicuddy turned to her friend. Well, did you discover anything useful? I'm not sure, replied Miss Marple thoughtfully. But there was something when I mentioned the railway line. Did you observe? Miss Stoddard's reaction. She seemed uncomfortable, agreed Mrs. McGillicuddy. Yes, quite so. And then there's that sarcophagus. What about it? Miss Marple's eyes took on that far away. Look, do you recall exactly what you saw on the train? Elspeth, you said. The woman was wearing something blue beneath her coat. Yes, a blue dress or suit. I couldn't see clearly. And the man had his back to you, so you couldn't see his face. But if you were to see him again, perhaps from behind, do you think you might recognize him? I might, said Mrs. McGillicuddy slowly. He was wearing a dark overcoat, quite broad-shouldered. I think, said Miss Marple decisively, that we should walk down to the railway line tomorrow and observe where it passes Rutherford Hall. There's a public footpath that crosses it, if I remember correctly. You think the body might be somewhere on the grounds? It seems a possibility worth exploring, said Miss Marple, though I doubt It would be anywhere obvious. As they reached the village, Miss Marple stopped suddenly. "Oh, I've just remembered something in the case of Tom Pickering. The village incident I mentioned. The body was discovered in a place. No one thought to look initially. It was only when Dr. Hawk's spaniel found it that anyone realized she broke off her mind working rapidly the sarcophagus in the garden. Ancient stone heavy, a perfect hiding place perhaps, but no too obvious, and yet there had been something about it that nagged at her memory. Elspeth, she said, suddenly, when you return to London, I wonder. If you might do something for him, of course, Jane. What is it? I should like you to visit the British Museum. There's an exhibition of Roman antiquities. I believe I'd like you to look at any sarcophagi they might have and tell me something about them. Their construction in particular." Mrs. McGee looked baffled but agreed willingly enough. As they parted at Miss Marple's gate, the old lady stood for a moment gazing thoughtfully in the direction of Rutherford Hall, just visible on its hill in the distance. The winter sun was setting, casting long shadows across the village somewhere. In that imposing house, Miss Marple felt certain, lay the answer to the mystery of the woman murdered on the 450 from Paddington, and she, Jane Marple, wouldn't cover it no matter how deeply buried it might be. Chapter 4. Connections and Coincidences. Coincidences. The Morning Post brought a letter for Miss Marple from her godson, Detective Inspector Crack. She opened it with her silver paper knife and adjusted her spectacles carefully before reading. "Well?" inquired Mrs. McGillicuddy, who was buttering her toast with methodical precision. "Most interesting," replied Miss Marple, folding the letter and placing it beside her plate. "Dermot writes that a Madame Martin Dubois, a French woman employed as a lady's maid to the Countess of Westbourne, was reported missing 3 days ago. She was last seen boarding the 450 train from Paddington. She had been given 2 days' leave to visit a friend in Brampton." Mrs. McGill's hand, reaching for the marmalade, paused in mid-air. "The 450 from Paddington. But that's the train I was on precisely," said Miss Merrill. "And according to the description provided, she was wearing a dark coat over a blue dress." Mrs. McGillicuddy set down her knife with a clatter. "Jane, that must be the woman." "I saw being strangled. It seems a distinct possibility," agreed Miss Marple. "Dermot says the police are making inquiries, but so far there has been no trace of her. Her friend in Brampton claims she never arrived. Then they must believe me now. They're treating it as a missing person case," said Miss Marple. "Not a murder investigation without a body. You see, they cannot be certain that anything has happened to her. People do disappear of their own accord sometimes, but I saw her being murdered, yes." "Dear, I know and I believe you, but the police require evidence." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "There's another piece of information in Dermot's letter that I find particularly suggestive. The Countess of Westbourne has a connection to the Krakenthorpe family. Her late husband was the brother of Luther Krakenthorpe's wife, so this Frenchwoman, Martine Dubois, might have known the Krakenthorpes." "It's certainly possible," said Miss Marple, "and it might explain why the train journey took her past Rutherford Hall. Perhaps she even intended to visit after breakfast." Miss Marple announced her intention to visit the village, their area. "Few inquiries I wish to make," she explained. "Perhaps you would care to join me, Elspeth." Their first call was at the post office, which doubled as the village shop. Miss Marple purchased some knitting wool and inquired after pattern, a transaction that inevitably led to conversation with Mrs. Bloom, the postmistress, a woman whose appetite for information was matched only by her willingness to share it. "I understand there's been some changes up at Rutherford Hall," remarked Miss Marple, counting her change with care. "Oh, yes," Miss replied. Mrs. Bloom eagerly, "That Miss Stoddard's moved in relation of old Mr. Kraken. Thorpe, they say, between you and me." She lowered her voice conspiratorially. "They do say she came into some money recently. Inheritance-like funny. How she turns up just when. She's got something to her name, isn't it? Not that the old man's likely to see any of it. Tight as a tick he is. Do the family visit often?" inquired Miss Marple innocently. "Not what you'd call regular, though young Mr. Harold was down last weekend, came on the afternoon train. Saturday he did and went back Sunday. City gent, very proper. And Mr. Alfred was here the week before, always coming and going." That one got his finger in all sorts of pies, they say. Not all of them quite proper, if you understand me. And the other son, Cedric, I believe him, haven't seen him in months, lives abroad. Painting pictures of ladies without their Mrs. Bloom, caught herself, and coughed well. Not respectable pictures, so I hear. But funny enough, Mrs. Stodd was saying in here yesterday that he's for a visit cancelled some trip to France he has and is coming. To stay at the hall instead, most unexpected by all accounts. Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy continued their tour of the village, stopping next at the hairdresser's, where Miss Marple had an appointment to have her hair set while under the dryer she engaged the young assistant in conversation. "My niece is looking for work as a gardener," she remarked. "I heard that the gardener at Rufford Hall has left. Do you know if they're looking to replace him?" The girl, whose name was Gladys, was eager tutelage. "Oh yes. Miss Old Tom Fletcher quit last week, said he couldn't work there no more. Gave no notice, neither indeed that. Seems rather sudden. It was Miss. My young man Jimmy works at the station. You know, he says Tom came in on Tuesday afternoon looking white, as a sheet, saying he'd seen something up at the hall that had proper frightened him. Had 3 large whiskeys one after the other, which isn't like Tom at all, wouldn't say what it was. He'd seen, though." Miss Merrill digested this information silently. After her hair was satisfactorily arranged, she and Mrs. McGillicuddy made their way to the vicarage where they had been invited. "For coffee, Jane, dear, how lovely to see you," exclaimed Hilda Harmon, showing them into the sitting room, and Mrs. McGillicuddy, "Oh, too, you're just in time. I've had the most distressing letter from Lucy." "Lucy?" inquired Miss Marple. "My goddaughter, Lucy Armstrong. She's a teacher at the school in the village, such a pretty girl and clever too. But she's been receiving the most awful anonymous letters, threatening notes suggesting someone is watching her." "How very unpleasant," said Miss Marple. "Has she informed the police?" "She's reluctant to involve them. You know how these things can cause talk. But I'm seriously concerned, especially after what happened to poor Heather Badcock last year with those poison pen letters." After a suitable interval discussing Lucy's predicament, Miss Marple skillfully turned the conversation to Rutherford Hall and its occupants. "My husband knew the family quite well," said Mrs. Harmon. "Old Mr. Crackenthorpe. Luther's father was a churchwarden here. Luther inherited the house, but the money was left in trust. He only gets the income. You see, the capital goes to his children after his death, a not uncommon arrangement," observed Miss Marple. "Though it can lead to certain tensions." "Indeed," agreed Mrs. Harmon. "The children are constantly short of money. Understand, and Luther lives forever. He's constantly ill, but never quite ill enough to die, if you see what I mean. It's rather tragic, really." Later, as they walked home, Mrs. McGillicuddy turned to her friend Jane. "Do you think any of this is connected to what I saw on the train?" "I'm not sure," said Miss Marple slowly, "but there are several points that interest me greatly. The missing Frenchwoman, the gardener who left so suddenly, the unexpected visit from the son who lives abroad, and then there's that anonymous letter writer. You think they're connected?" "In my experience," said Miss Marple, "there is no such thing as coincidence in a murder case. Everything is connected if one can only see the pattern." That evening, as darkness fell, Miss Marple sat by her window knitting, needles moving rhythmically as she gazed across to where the lights of Rutherford Hall gleamed faintly on the hill. So many loose threads. She thought the missing Martin Dubois, who might or might not be the woman Mrs. McGillicuddy had seen being murdered. The G-partner who had fled in terror, the young woman receiving threatening notes, the son who had changed his plans to visit, and always the railway line that passed so close to Rutherford Hall. She thought again of the heavy stone sarcophagus in the garden. There'd been something about it that troubled her. Something not quite right. A Roman artifact, Miss Stoddard had called it, brought back from Italy by the elder Mr. Crackenthorpe. But was it really as old as it appeared? And what secrets might it contain? The telephone rang, startling her from her reverie. It was Detective Inspector Craik. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice grave, "I think you should know that we've had a development in the case of the missing Frenchwoman. A blue leather handbag has been found beside the railway line about half a mile from Rutherford Hall. Inside was a passport in the name of Martin Dubois." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "Indeed," she said, "most significant. And was there anything else in the handbag? A handkerchief, some loose change, and a train ticket. A return to Brampton unused. Oh, and one other thing. a small notebook with several entries in French, and one name written and underlined several times. Emma Thorpe. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with the excitement of confirmation. The threads were beginning to connect soon. She felt sure a pattern would emerge, and with it the face. Chapter 5. The Woman in Blue Murderer. Chapter 5. The Woman in Blue. The name Emma Thorpe is most interesting, said Miss Marple as she poured coffee for Detective Inspector Craddock, who had arrived at her cottage the following morning when we were at Rutherford Hall. Miss Stoddard mentioned that Mr. Thorpe had 4 living children, Harold, Alfred, Cedric, and Emma. Indeed, Craddock raised an eyebrow, but Miss Stodd introduced herself to you as Emma Stoddard. Precisely, said Miss Marple. Here ye's brightening with the pleasure of a connection made, so either there is another Emma, a daughter whom Miss Stodd did not mention, or Miss Stodd is in fact Emma Kraken, thought finished KCK. But why would she use a different name that said, Miss Marple is what we must discover, after Detective Inspector Crack departed, promising to make discreet inquiries about the identity of Emma Stoddard. Miss Marple set forth on her own investigations. Her first call was to the village hairdresser, where appointments were not merely occasions for having one's hair attended to, but valuable opportunities for gathering information. Good morning, Miss Marple said. Mr. James, the proprietor. The usual today, if you please, she replied, settling herself in the chair. I do hope you might have a copy of yesterday's newspaper. I meant to check the photograph of that poor missing woman. The French lady Mr. James reached for a folded newspaper on the counter. Terrible business, they say she disappeared. Somewhere on the train line, makes you wonder, doesn't it? Miss Marple studied the photograph. On the second page it showed a fashionably dressed woman in her 30s with a confident expression and a distinctive blue coat. Such a lovely coat, she murmured. Such a beautiful shade of blue Parisian, I'd say, offered Mr. James, who considered himself something of an authority on fashion. You don't see that quality in English tailoring. As she left the hairdresser, Miss Marple's mind was working rapidly. The blue coat in the photograph was remarkably similar to what Mrs. Millikie had described seeing on the woman in the train. The coincidence was too striking to ignore. Her next visit was to Mrs. Blackett, the doctor's wife and the organizer of the Winter Relief Fund Committee, I was thinking, said Miss Marple, after they had discussed the committee's progress, that we might arrange another meeting at Rutherford Hall. Miss Stoddard seemed quite amiable, and it would be helpful to have Mrs. McGill's input. Before Cher turns to London, an excellent idea, agreed Mrs. Blackett. I'll telephone Miss Stoddard this afternoon. She did mention she was expecting family visitors, but perhaps early next week would suit. Family visitors, inquired Miss Marple innocently. Yes, apparently her cousin Luther's sons are coming to stay. Harold and Alfred have already arrived, and Cedric is expected tomorrow. It will be quite a reunion, I gather. Miss Marple absorbed this information with interest. How delightful. And is there an Emma among the family? I thought I heard mention of a daughter. Mrs. Black looked confused. I'm not aware of a daughter. There were 3 sons. And I believe there was a 4th child who died, young Edmund. I think his name was, but no Emma that I've ever heard of. Miss Marple returned home to find Mrs. McGillicuddy engaged in conversation with the vicar's wife, who had called to ask if Mrs. McGillicuddy might assist with the church flower arrangements before her departure. I've just been telling Mrs. McGillicuddy about poor Lucy's predicament, said Mrs. Harmon as Miss Merrill entered those dreadful anonymous letters. And now she says she's seen someone watching her cottage at night. Most distressing, said Miss Marple. Has she any idea who might be responsible? None at all. Though she did mention something curious. The latest note referred to justice coming by rail. Whatever that might mean, it sounds almost like a threat. After Mrs. Harmon had departed, Miss Marple shared her discoveries with Mrs. McGillicuddy. The photograph in the newspaper confirms that Martin Dubois was wearing a blue coat, she said, and I'm increasingly convinced that Emma Stoddard is not who she claims to be. But who is she then? Asked Mrs. McGillicuddy. I'm not certain yet, replied Miss Marple, but I think it's time we arrange for you to see the Thorpe men. If one of them is the murderer you witnessed, you might recognize him. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Mrs. Blackett telephoned to say that Miss Stoddard had agreed to host another committee meeting the following day. She seemed quite eager, in fact, reported Mrs. Blackett, said it would be a welcome distraction from family matters. The next day dawned cold and clear. Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy set out for Rutherford Hall, taking the longer route that passed by the railway embankment. As they walked, Miss Marple outlined her plan. You must observe each of the men carefully, Elspeth. Not just their faces, but their build, their posture, the set of their shoulders. The man you saw had his back to you, but there might be something about him you would recognize. I'll do my best, promised Mrs. McGillicuddy. Though it was all so quick and the trains were moving as they approached Rutherford Hall, they could see that there were more cars in the drive than on their previous visit. The atmosphere inside the house was noticeably different as well. Voice could be heard from the drawing room, male voices engaged in what seemed to be a heated discussion that abruptly ceased as Emma Stoddard ushered the visitors in. Miss Merrill, Mrs. McGill-Cuddy, she said with a slightly strained smile. How kind of you to come. Allow me to introduce my cousins. 3 men rose as they entered. Harold Kraken. Thorpe was tall, distinguished, with silver at his temples and the unmistakable air of a man accustomed to boardrooms and authority. Alfred was shorter, sharper somehow, with quick movements and watchful eyes, and Cedric, clearly the youngest, was tanned and casual, with an artist's disregard for convention evident in his rumpled attire. My cousins have kindly agreed to leave us to our committee business, said Emma Stoddard. They were just going out for a walk around the grounds in this weather, said Alfred with a short laugh. It was rather more that we were being evicted, I think. Nonsense, Alfred, said Harold smoothly. Ladies, please don't let us disturb you. We'll find somewhere else to continue our discussion. Miss Marple observed Mrs. McGillicuddy closely as the men filed past. Her friend's expression remained politely neutral until Cedric Kraken Thorpe approached. Then almost imperceptibly she stiffened, her hand tightening on her handbag. The meeting proceeded with discussions of fundraising strategies and volunteer rotors, but Miss Marple's attention was only partly engaged. She was watching Emma Stoddard, noting the strain beneath her composure, the slight tremor in her hands as she poured tea. As the meeting concluded and the committee members began to depart, Miss Marple deliberately lingered, engaging Emma in conversation about the garden while the others made their way out. That sarcophagus is such an unusual feature, she remarked. I don't believe I've ever seen one used as a garden ornament before. It was my uncle's idea, replied Emma. He had eccentric tastes. I imagine it must be very heavy, said Miss Marple. Not the sort of thing one could move easily. Something flickered in Emma's eyes, a momentary unease quickly masked. No, indeed, it hasn't been moved since it was installed 30 years ago. As twilight began to fall, Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy were the last to leave. They had just reached the end of the drive when they heard a scream from the direction of the outbuildings. What on earth was that? Exclaimed Mrs. McGillicuddy. Without waiting for an answer, Miss Marple turned and hurried back toward the house, her friend following reluctantly. They found a small crowd gathered outside the old stables. The Kraken Thor brothers, Emma, and an elderly man in gardening clothes who was visibly shaking. What's happened? Inquired Miss Merrill. Nothing to concern yourself with, said Harold Kraken Thorpe firmly. Old Hillman thinks he saw something, that's all. Not think, sir, insisted the old gardener. I saw her plain as day, a woman in a blue coat standing right there by the tackroom door, and when I called out she vanished just like that. Nonsense, said Alfred sharply. The light's tricky at this time of day. Was probably just a shadow, but Miss Marple had noticed how pale Emma Stoddard had become, and how Cedric Kraken Thorpe's eyes had darted nervously toward the railway embankment beyond the garden wall as they finally departed Rutherford Hall. Darkness had fallen completely. The lights of the house glowed behind them, and in the distance came the whistle of a train passing through the night. Well, said Miss Marple quietly. Did you recognize any of them? Elspeth. Mrs. McGill. Cuddy hesitated. I'm not certain, she said slowly, but there was something about Cedric Kraken Thorpe, something in the set of his shoulders that seemed familiar, of course. I couldn't swear to it, no, said Miss Marple, but it's a beginning. She glanced back at the looming silhouette of Rutherford Hall against the night sky, and I think our ghostly woman in blue is a sign that someone is growing nervous. The question is, which of them is it? The wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the sound of another train rushing through the darkness, a reminder that death had come to Rutherford Hall by rail. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Sarcophagus. Miss Marple was engaged in a contemplative pruning of her winter roses when the telephone rang. The following morning she sat down her secateurs with a sigh and went to answer it. Miss Marple, it was Detective Inspector Craddock. I thought you should know that we found something rather significant. A blue silk scarf partially buried near the railway embankment where it passes Rutherford Hall. It has the initials MD embroidered. In one corner. Martin. Dubois, said Miss Merrill softly, precisely. We conducting a more thorough search of the grounds today. I've secured permission from Mr. Crackenthorpe, rather reluctantly granted I might add, and have you discovered anything about Emma Stoddard? Yes, and it's most peculiar. There's no record of an Emma Stoddard connected to the Crackenthorpe family. However, Luther Crackenthorpe did indeed have a daughter named Emma, who has been living abroad for many years. She trained as a nurse and worked in various parts of Europe. How very interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Will you be at Rutherford Hall this afternoon? I will. We're focusing our search on the area around the old sarcophagus in the garden. One of my men noticed that the ground around it appears to have been disturbed recently after she had relayed this information to Mrs. McGillicuddy. Miss Marple suggested they take a walk past Rutherford Hall. It would be most informative to observe the police search, she explained, and there's a perfectly good public footpath that runs along the edge of the property. As they approached the hall, they could see several police officers methodically examining the area around the old stone sarcophagus. Emma Stoddard stood watching from the terrace, her arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the heavy cardigan she wore. The three Crackenthorpe brothers were nowhere to be seen. Good afternoon, Inspector, called Miss Marple as they reached the garden wall. I see you're making progress. Craddock looked up and nodded, coming over to speak to them. We found some soil disturbance that's relatively recent, he said in a loud voice, and there's something odd about the sarcophagus itself. It appears to be a modern reproduction, not a genuine Roman artifact, as claimed, I suspect. "'Tis much," said Miss Marple. "The carving is too well preserved, and the stone is not consistent with authentic Romans' sarcophagi. My friend Mrs. McGill-Cuddy visited the British Museum yesterday and examined their collection." "Indeed, I did," confirmed Mrs. McGillicuddy, "and this one is quite different. We're going to examine it more closely," said Craddock. "I've sent for equipment to move it." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "And where are the Crackenthorpe gentlemen today?" "Harold has returned to London on business, though he promised to come back this evening. Alfred is in the village at the pub, I believe, and Cedric is supposedly painting in the old stable block, though I haven't seen him for some time, I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "and Miss Stoddard has." She offered any explanation for the discrepancy in her name. "None that makes much sense," replied Craddock. "She claimed she used her mother's maiden name when she first arrived because she wanted to assess the situation before revealing her identity. Says she was concerned about how her father would react after so many years of estrangement." "A plausible explanation," observed Miss Marple, "though not necessarily the true one." They watched as the police continued their methodical search. One officer was carefully examining the area beneath a rhododendron book bush near the sarcophagus, and suddenly called out, "Sir, I found something." Craddock hurried over, followed secretly by Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy. The officer was holding up a woman's scarf, not blue this time, but a deep burgundy color. "There are spots on it, sir," said the officer. "Might be blood." Craddock examined it carefully. "Bag it for forensic analysis," he ordered, and widened the search area. "Whatever we're looking for, we're getting close." At that moment, Emma Stoddard hurried down from the terrace, her face pale but composed. "Inspector," she said, "I think I should tell you something. There's an old meat freezer in one of the outbuildings. It hasn't been used in years, but I noticed recently That someone appears to have moved it. Crack's eyes sharpened. Show me, he said as Emma led the inspector toward a dilapidated brick building at the far end of the garden. Miss Marple and Mrs. McGillicuddy exchanged glances. Shall we, said Miss Marple. They followed at a discreet distance, arriving at the outbuilding, just as Craddock and two officers were struggling to open the rusted door of an ancient chest freezer. It's locked, said one of the officers. Break it open, ordered Craddock. The sound of splintering metal echoed in the quiet garden as the lock gave way. A wave of cold air escaped. As the lid was raised, accompanied by a faint, unpleasant odor, Mrs. McGillicuddy took an involuntary step backward. Stay back. Please, ladies, said Crack, though. He made no real attempt to prevent Miss Marple from seeing the contents of the freezer inside. Wrapped in what appeared to be an old curtain was the body of a woman. Her face, though discolored, was clearly visible as the officers carefully unwrapped. The makeshift shroud, is this the woman you saw on the train? Mrs. McGillicuddy asked Craddock. Mrs. McGillicuddy stepped forward hesitantly, then shook her head. I can't be certain, she said. It all happened so quickly, and her face was distorted. It's Martine. Dubois, said Emma, stuttered. Suddenly everyone turned to look at her. I recognize her from the photograph in the newspaper. She came here. You know, about 2 weeks ago she was looking for someone who asked credit sharply. She wouldn't say she asked to speak to my father, but he refused to see her. She seemed upset, said it was a family matter of great importance. I offered her tea, but she declined and left rather abruptly. And you didn't think to mention this when the police began inquiring about a missing woman? Crack's tone was incredulous. I didn't make the connection until I saw her picture in the paper, said Emma. And by then she trailed off, glancing at the freezer. By then you feared she had met with foul play on your property, finished Craddock. I think you'd better come to the station, Miss Stoddard. Or should I say, Miss Crackenthorpe. We have a great many questions for you. As Emma was led away, Miss Marple remained by the outbuilding, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the scene. The freezer, the body, the location of the outbuilding in relation to the main house and the railway line. All these she noted with methodical precision. There's something not quite right about this, Elspeth, she murmured to her friend. The timing is wrong. What do you mean? If this is indeed Martine, and if she is the woman you saw being murdered on the train, then how did she come to visit Rutherford Hall 2 weeks ago, and why would her murderer preserve her body rather than dispose of it later that evening? As they sat before the fire in Miss Marple's cottage, they learned that Inspector Craddock had released Emma Crackenthorpe. After questioning, she had provided a verifiable alibi for the day of Martin Dubois' disappearance. But if she didn't do it, then who did, wondered Mrs. McGillicuddy, and why keep the body hidden on the property? It seems so risky unless, said Miss Marple slowly, the intention was for it to be found, eventually found and identified as Martin Dubb. But why would anyone want that? Miss Merrill didn't answer immediately. She was thinking of Emma's revelation that Martin had come seeking someone, claiming it was a family matter, and she was thinking of the ominous note Lucy Armstrong had received. Justice. Chapter 7. The Train Schedule Rail. Chapter 7. The Train Schedule. The identification of the body found in the freezer as that of Martin Dubois was confirmed the following day. Detective Inspector Craddock called at Miss Marple's cottage to share this information along with the medical examiner preliminary findings. She was strangled, he said, accepting the cup of tea Miss Marple offered. But the time of death is proving difficult to establish precisely due to the freezing of the body. The best estimate puts it between 10 days and 2 weeks ago, not 3 weeks ago, when Mrs. Craddock witnessed the murder on the train, inquired Miss Marple gently. Craddock frowned. No, definitely not. The pathologist is quite certain about that. Then we have a puzzle, said Miss Marple. Either the woman my friend saw being murdered was not Martin Dubois, or I was mistaken about what I saw, interrupted Mrs. McGillicuddy, who was sitting by the window. But I wasn't Jane. I know what I saw. I believe you, said Miss Marple firmly. Which means that there is a more complex explanation. She turned Craddock. Have you been able to establish the movements of the Crackenthorpe family members on the day Mrs. McGillicuddy witnessed the murder? We're working on it, said Craddock. Harold Kraken Thorpe was in London according to his secretary and several business associates. Alfred's whereabouts are less clear. He claims to have been in Birmingham, but so far we found no one to verify that Cedric was supposedly an IA, though he admits to having been in London briefly around that time. And Emma was here at Rutherford Hall, which several villages can confirm. And Mr. Luther Kraken Thorpe bedridden, according to his doctor and the daily nurse who attends him. He rarely leaves his room. These days after Craddock had departed, Miss Marple sat thoughtfully by the fire, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she pondered the contradictions in the case. I think she said at last that we need to understand the trains, Elspeth the precise timing of them. The trains, echoed Mrs. McGillicuddy. Yes, on the day you witnessed the murder, you were on the 4:50 from Paddington, which was held at a signal before passing Rutherford Hall. The other train, the one in which you saw the murder take place, was traveling in the opposite direction. That's right. Our trains were moving alongside each other for a brief moment, and it is that moment which I believe is crucial, said Miss Marple. We need to know exactly which train that was, and precisely when, and where the two trains would have passed each other the following morning. Found them at St. Miriam's Station, where the elderly station master Mr. Lamb greeted Miss Marple with the difference due to a long-standing and respected resident train schedules. Miss Marple, well, now that's a specialized subject. He led them into his small office and produced a thick timetable. Now the 4:50 from Paddington arrives here at 5:38, having stopped at Brackhampton and a few other stations on the day in question, or was held at the signal just before the Rutherford Hall curve for approximately 4 minutes. And what trains would have passed it going in the opposite direction? During that time, asked Miss Marple. Mr. Lamb consulted his timetable. Well, there's the express from Brampton to London, which doesn't stop here, that passes through at 5:28. But if the 4:50 was delayed at the signal, they wouldn't have passed each other at the usual spot. Where would they have passed? Inquired Miss Merrill. Let me see. If the 4:50 was held at the signal for 4 minutes, then released, they would have passed each other right about at the Rutherford Hall curve. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, exactly as Mrs. McGillicuddy described. And would those trains be close enough for a passenger to see clearly into the opposite train? Oh yes, nodded Mr. Lamb, that's a sharp curve. So the tracks run quite close together. They're dangerously close. Some might say there's been talk of realigning that section for years, but the cost, after thanking Mr. Lamb, they made their way to the village library, where Miss Marple had arranged to meet George Wetherell, a retired railway engineer known for his encyclopedic knowledge of trains and his elaborate model railway collection. The Rutherford Hall curve, mused Mr. Wetherell, when Miss Marple posed her question. Yes, that's a peculiar section of track. The two lines run almost parallel for about a quarter mile, if one train is stationary or moving slowly after being held at the signal, and the other is traveling at full speed on the opposite line. They would pass quite close, mostly. Indeed. And would it be possible, asked Miss Marple, choosing her words carefully, for someone to move from one train to the other? At that point, Mr. Wetherell looked shocked. Good heavens. No, the trains would be moving at different speeds. Anyone attempting such a thing would be risking certain death. But if the trains were moving at exactly the same speed just for a moment, well, theoretically, I suppose it might be possible if the windows of both carriages were open, and the individual was extraordinarily agile, but it would be extremely dangerous and highly improbable. Miss Merrill thanked him for his insights, and as they walked back to her cottage, she shared her emerging theory with Mrs. McGillicuddy. I believe that what you witnessed, Elspeth, was indeed a murder, but I'm beginning to suspect that it was a murder committed for a very specific purpose, to be seen. But who would want a murder to be witnessed, someone said. Miss Marple, who needed a very particular kind of alibi, or perhaps someone who wanted to create confusion about when and where a murder actually took place. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Craddock, whose grave expression suggested new developments. There's been another death, he announced as soon as they were seated in Miss Marple's parlor. Dr. Quimper, the Kraken Thorpe family physician, was found dead in his surgery this morning. Apparent cyanide poisoning. Dr. Quimper, gasped Mrs. McGillicuddy. But why, before he died, he managed to write a note, said Crack. It's rather cryptic. It says wrong woman check December 20th. Does that mean anything to either of you? Miss Marple's eyes widened. December 20th was the day Mrs. McGillicuddy witnessed the murder on the train, and wrong woman mashed Craddock. Could that refer to Martin Dubois? Are we looking at the wrong victim, I believe? Said Miss Marple slowly. The Dr. Quimper may have realized something crucial about the medical evidence. Perhaps he discovered that the woman in the freezer was not killed on the day Mrs. McGillicuddy witnessed the murder on the train. But who is the right woman? Then asked Craddock. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was remembering Emma Stoddard's, or rather Emma Crackenthorpe's reaction when questioned about the sarcophagus and the old gardener's claim of seeing a woman in blue near the stables. She was thinking of Lucy Armstrong and the threatened notes about justice coming by rail. And she was recalling a detail from Tom Pickering's old case that had been nagging at her memory inspector. She said, at last, I believe we need to look more closely at the family history of the Crackenthorpes, particularly any connections they might have to a woman who could have been traveling on that train on December 20th. I've already started those inquiries, said Craddock, and I found something rather interesting. It seems that Edmund Crackenthorpe, the brother who died young, was married briefly before his death. His widow subsequently moved to France. Her name was Lucy. Lucy, exclaimed Mrs. McG. But that's the name of the vicar's goddaughter who has been receiving those threatening notes. Yes, said Miss Marple, her eyes alight with the satisfaction of a connection made. Lucy Armstrong. And I wonder if she might have known more about the Crackenthorpe family than she has admitted, as Craddock departed, promising to investigate this new lead. Miss Marple stood by her window, gazing toward Rutherford Hall, barely visible on its hill in the gathering dusk. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, yet the complete picture remained elusive. The train schedule is the key. She murmured to herself the precise timing of those trains passing and what happened in that brief moment when they ran side by side in the gathering darkness of a December afternoon. She turned from the window, her expression resolute. The truth was drawing nearer, but so too was danger somewhere at Rutherford Hall. A killer waited, a killer who had already struck twice and would not hesitate to strike again to protect a deadly secret. Chapter 8. The Woman Who Wasn't. There wasn't there. The drawing room at Rutherford Hall had been arranged for what Miss Marple had described to Detective Inspector Craddock as a necessary gathering. The cold winter light filtered through the tall windows, illuminating the assembled company. Luther Crackenthorpe, propped up in a wheelchair, his thin face both petulant and suspicious. His three sons, Harold, Alfred, and Cedric Rain Ed, uncomfortably around him. Emma Crackenthorpe, standing near the fireplace. Lucy Armstrong, the vicar's goddaughter, seated in a corner looking pale but composed, and Mrs. McGillicuddy stationed. Near the door, Detective Inspector Craddock stood by the mantelpiece, his official presence lending gravity to the proceedings. Miss Marple sat in an armchair, her knitting in her lap, the picture of elderly innocence, though her bright eyes missed. Nothing. I've asked you all to gather here, began Craddock, because Miss Marple believes she has unraveled the mystery surrounding the death of Martin Dubois and Dr. Quimper. I've found her insights invaluable in previous cases and have every confidence in her conclusions. Preposterous, muttered Luther Crackenthorpe, an elderly spinster solving what the police cannot miss. Apple smiled gently. Sometimes, Mr. Crackenthorpe, those whom society tends to overlook afforded the clearest view. She set aside her knitting and leaned forward. Lightly, this case began with what appeared to be a simple, if shocking, observation Mrs. McGillicuddy witnessed. A murder on a train, but as we've discovered, the reality is far more complex. She turned to Emma. Miss Renthorpe, would you be kind enough to tell us when you first arrived at Rutherford Hall? Emma looked startled. About 6 weeks ago I'd been living abroad. As you know, and what prompted your return, I received a letter from a solicitor informing me that a distant aunt had left me a small inheritance. It seemed an opportune time to reconnect with my family. A convenient explanation, said Miss Marple, but not, I think, the truth. You see, I've made inquiries about the Crackenthorpe family history. There never was an Emma Crackenthorpe. A stunned silence followed this pronouncement. "What nonsense is this?" demanded Luther, his face flushing with anger. "Not nonsense, but fact," said Miss Marple calmly. "You had 3 sons, Harold, Alfred, and Cedric, and 1 daughter, but her name was not Emma. It was Elena." Emma's face had gone very white. "How did you know?" "Parish records are remarkably informative," said Miss Marple. "As our old newspaper announcements, Elena Thorpe supposedly died at the age of 16 in a boating accident. Her body was never recovered. My sister did die," insisted Harold. "I remember the funeral." "There was a funeral," agreed Miss Marple, "but nobody. In the casket, Elena ran away, didn't she? She eloped with someone her father considered unsuitable." Luther Thorpe's hands gripped the arms of his wheelchair. "That's enough. I won't have my family affairs exposed in this manner." "I'm afraid they must," said Craddock firmly. "There have been 2 murders. Elena Thorpe continued. Miss Marple created a new identity for herself. She trained as a nurse, worked abroad, and eventually, using her inheritance from her aunt, engineered her return to Rutherford Hall under the name Emma Stoddard. But there was a complication: someone who knew her true identity. Martin Dubois. Martin knew Eleanor years ago in France, said Cedric. Unexpectedly, she recognized her photograph in a newspaper story about the winter relief fund. That's why she came here, to blackmail her, suggested Crack, or perhaps merely to renew an old acquaintance, said Miss Marple. "We shall never know, because Eleanor Thorpe, or Emma Stoddard as she called herself, had too much at stake to risk exposure." All eyes turned to Emma, who remained very still. "You don't understand," she said softly. "None of you understand what it was like." "I think I do," said Miss Mary. "You ran away from a tyrannical father, built a new life for yourself, and then saw an opportunity to claim what you believed was rightfully yours, a share in the family fortune. But there was a fatal flaw in your plan. The terms of your grandfather's trust specified that the capital would be divided among Luther Thorpe's children after his death. As the supposedly deceased Eleanor, you had been excluded. You needed to establish yourself as Emma Stoddard, a previously unknown relation, and somehow ensure that you would be included in the will. That's absurd," protested Harold. "Father would never. Your father was already rewriting his will to include." Emma interrupted Craddock. "We found the draft documents in Dr. Quimper's office." "But what has all this to do with the murder?" "Mrs. McGill, could E.W. witnessed?" asked Alfred impatiently. "Everything," said Miss Marple, "because that murder was elaborately staged for the specific purpose of being seen." "Mrs. McGill," Cootie gasped. "Staged. But I saw it with my own eyes." "Yes, you did," agreed Miss Marple, "and you are a reliable witness. But what you saw was not the murder of Martin Dubb. It was a carefully choreographed scene performed at precisely the moment when your rain and the London-bound express would run parallel on the Rutherford Hall curve." "But who was the woman I saw being strangled?" demanded Mrs. McGill Cuddy. "There was no woman," said Miss Marple, "simply, at least not in the sense we assumed. What you saw was Elena Thorpe, whom we know as Emma, struggling with a dressmaker's dummy dressed in a blue coat, similar to the one worn by Martin Dubois. The apartment was otherwise empty. As soon as the trains passed each other, she disposed of the dummy and exited at the next station. She then returned to Rutherford Hall via taxi, just in time to establish her presence here when the committee members arrived for tea." "But why?" asked Cedric. "Why go to such elaborate lengths to create confusion about when Martin Dubois was killed?" Explained Miss Marple. "Elena had already murdered her days earlier and concealed the body in the freezer by staging a murder on the train that would be witnessed and reported. She created the impression that Martin was killed on that specific day, a day for which Eleanor had a perfect alibi." "The wrong woman," murmured Craddock, recalling Dr. Quimper's dying message on December 20th. "The date of the staged murder, not the real one." Precisely, nodded Miss Marple. Dr. Quimper had been asked to examine the medical records and realized the discrepancy in the timing. The body showed signs of death occurring days before the train incident. When he questioned Emma about it, she poisoned him to prevent him from revealing the truth. "You can't prove any of this," said Emma, or Elena, her voice steady despite her pallor. "Oh, but we can," said Craddock. We found the dressmaker dummy concealed in the old stables, the source of the ghost sighting and traces of the same poison that killed Dr. Quimper were found in your room. As Craddock stepped forward to make the arrest, Lucy Armstrong suddenly spoke. "There's something else you should know, Inspector." The threatening notes I received, I recognized the handwriting. It was Emma's. She knew I had been engaged to Edmund before his death, and feared I might have old photographs or documents that could expose her true identity. Edmund's widow was named Lucy Sade Miss Marple, but not Lucy Armstrong. That was merely a coincidence that Elena sought to exploit through intimidation. Elena Krakenthorpe looked around the room, her gaze finally settling on her father. "All I wanted was what was rightfully mine," she said. "The share of the inheritance you denied me when you drove me away, is that so terrible enough to kill?" "For," said Miss Marple quietly later, as Miss Marple and Mrs. McGill-Cooty sat before the fire in the cottage they reflected on. "The resolution of the case, the perfect crime," mused Mrs. McGill-Cooty, "or nearly." "So no crime is perfect," said Miss Marple, resuming her knitting. "There are always loose threads, always patterns that don't quite match. Elena might have succeeded if not for your keen observation, Elspeth, and Dr. Quimper's medical expertise and your remarkable insight." Jane Miss Marple smiled modestly. "In St. Mary Me, one sees the whole of human nature. In miniature, years ago, the postmistress's niece created an elaborate deception. To claim an inheritance she believed she deserved, the pattern was remarkably similar, though thankfully without the tragic consequences." She gazed thoughtfully into the flames. "What a sad business it all is." Elena's life was shaped by bitterness and a sense of injustice that festered over decades. She convinced herself that reclaiming her birthright justified any action, however deplorable, a heavy price to pay for what might have been freely given, had there been honesty instead of deception observed. "Mrs. McGill-Cooty indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "The truth may travel slowly like that train making its way along the curve at Rutherford Hall, but in the end it always reaches its destination, and justice, though it may follow a winding track, arrives at last, with the certainty of a timetable outside. The winter night had settled over St. Me, and in the distance came the mournful whistle of a train.